We've all heard the stories of sailors using the stars to navigate their ships to distant shores, establishing trade routes, discovering new lands, and returning safely home, hopefully without scurvy. Continuing that proud naval tradition, Brandon Darnall, a U.S. Navy sailor, set up a trade network of spice from a foreign land under the brilliant night sky of the California high desert. But this spice wasn't cinnamon or ginger. It was methylone, an analogue for ecstasy. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I'll make the resources for today's case available in the show notes. I relied on opinions from the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals and the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. In November 2011, Federal Customs and Border Control agents intercepted a package from China that was addressed to a Brandon Darnall at a home off base near 29 Palms. 29 Palms is technically a city in San Bernardino County, California. It's out in the high desert near Joshua Tree National Park. The Marine Corps base in 29 is a big one. They have a lot of space to practice being Marines. But the same things that make it great for the military's purposes, that it's remote, that it's got open spaces, that it's got room to go boom, makes it a little more challenging to, live there. The people who assign Marines to jobs and bases sometimes seem a little desperate to put bums in seats out at 29. And if you volunteer for the area, they're happy to give it to you. They really do try to sell you on it, saying it's close to Palm Springs, it's close to San Diego, it's close to Las Vegas. In reality, it's an hour from Palm Springs, 3 hours from San Diego, and 3.5 hours from Las Vegas. The primary industry is definitely the base. Anyway, the package addressed to Brandon Darnall was suspicious. Customs opened this suspicious package and discovered 2 pounds of powdered dimethylone. Dimethylone and methylone were commonly used to make spice or bath salts and were sold in smoke shops prior to Drug Enforcement Agency bans. And I know what you're all thinking. Are these the same bath salts that turned a Florida man into a face-eating zombie? No. Zombie bath salts were made from mephedrone and methylene dioxypyrovalerone, also known as MDPV, which are more similar to methamphetamine and cocaine. The bath salts made from dimethylone and methylone are more similar to methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, whatever you'd like to call it. Dimethylone and methylone are both analogues to MDMA. They're chemically slightly different, but produce the same effect. You may have heard these sorts of drugs referred to before as designer drugs. I learned while researching for this case that MDMA was originally developed for applications in antidepressants, but it lives out its life as a party drug instead. Customs believed the recipient on the package was likely a service member, given the address, and decided to pass the package to military investigators like a little drug hot potato. They passed it more specifically to the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division at 29 Palms. There were only 3 people named Brandon Darnall in all of San Bernardino County, which at the time was home to 2.2 million people. And only one of those 3 was assigned to the base at 29 Palms. 29 Palms at that point had a population of 25,000 people, so this felt like a fairly logical conclusion. The package label only had Brandon Darnall's name, the 29 Palms address, and a phone number. So a bit more information about the Brandon Darnall that was in the service. Brandon Darnall joined the Navy in 2007 and served as a Navy hospitalman assigned to the 29 Palms Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Center. That might sound a little weird, a sailor assigned to a Marine Corps base, so let's take a small step back. The United States Marine Corps falls under the Department of the Navy, and the Marine Corps is a lot smaller than the Navy. There's a reason the movie is called A Few Good Men. When you have this smaller budget, you have to be really strategic. Do you want to try and do lots of things without much depth? Or do you want to try and do a few things really, really well? The Marine Corps relies on the United States Navy for the services they can't afford to provide themselves. things like doctors and dentists, and transportation on those big ships. The Marine Corps is essentially the naval infantry, and the Department of Defense describes the Navy and the Marine Corps as sister services. I, personally, am so tickled at the idea of calling them sisters. A Navy hospitalman, which is, in fact, their stab at a gender-neutral term, are also called corpsmen. They're most comparable to a civilian physician assistant. They work either at a naval medical facility or are embedded with a Marine Corps infantry unit. Between slinging ibuprofen during the day and maybe party drugs at night, Brandon really took his work home and could have benefited from some work-life separation. The Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division assigned Agent Pledger to the case, well, more accurately to the package. The Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, investigates reports of criminal conduct that are made to the Provost Marshal's office. The most common crimes they investigate are drug crimes, family violence, and theft. If a crime involves more serious misconduct, for example, sexual assault, murder, pornography that involves children, CID refers it up to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, also known as NCIS. The Marine Corps CID has a few other roles, including protective details for dignitaries, crisis negotiations, lie detector support, and working with local agencies. It might be important for our future cases to note that the Marine Corps CID is not the same as the Army CID, which is a bit more analogous to the NCIS. Agent Pledger began his investigation. He drove over to the address on the package and found no one. The home was unoccupied and there was a for rent sign posted. Agent Pledger did not attempt to call the phone number listed on the package or look up to whom it was registered. He didn't call the number on the for rent sign or talk to the owner. However, Agent Pledger did receive permission from his CID supervisor to replace the dimethylone with baby powder and flour and set up a pseudo sting. Agent Pledger planned to take the package to the regimental mailroom and deliver the package to Brandon Darnall in person. This means that Agent Pledger would get to the mailroom, ask the clerk to call Brandon, and summon him to pick up the box. The agent hoped this face-to-face delivery would help him gauge Brandon's facial reaction, kind of hoping to see a surprised Pikachu face. Agent Pledger stationed back up just outside the mailroom, ready to arrest Brandon no matter how the delivery went. While Agent Pledger was patiently waiting in the mailroom, Brandon received his mail call and came down. Agent Pledger handed Brandon the package, the anticipation building, and Brandon reacted as though he didn't remember ordering a package. I used to do this all the time when we were in Japan. I would pretend I didn't know what the package notification was for, as though I wasn't obsessively refreshing tracking numbers for literally anything I ordered from the United States, anxiously awaiting whatever purchase I'd made. I would say that it's the small pleasures in life, but one of these items was a queen-size mattress because the best the government could lend us for 3 years, for 2 grown adults, was a full-size mattress. As Brandon left the mailroom with the decoy package he definitely didn't remember ordering to the mailroom, 3 agents arrested him at taser point and brought him to CID for an interview, which is a much friendlier term for an interrogation. Interviewing agents read Brandon his 31 Bravo rights. That's basically the military equivalent of the Miranda warning. Brandon waived his 31 Bravo rights and started to chat. I'm not going to insert commentary here about how you have the right to an attorney for a reason. Brandon made a couple of admissions. First, yes, the package was addressed to him and he was the intended recipient. And second, that he had previously purchased methylone from China to sell to local smoke shops to make spice and bath salts. Hearing this makes me feel a little sweaty, thinking about how many people have the wrong impression about me because I told them the first thing I did when I got back to the United States was build a wall of spice. But it really is oregano, I swear. Brandon was careful in his admissions. He said he stopped importing methylone when the Drug Enforcement Agency issued an emergency ban the month previously, in October 2011. There's nothing to indicate whether the interviewing agents asked Brandon about the house he was ordering drugs to. To be fair, there's nothing to indicate anything that was discussed in this first interrogation because none of it was recorded due to a base power outage that affected the CID interview room. I've been told the interview rooms are pretty high speed, and I don't have details on whether the power outage started before the interview or if it happened during or after the interview and erased footage without saving. But given how the rest of the investigation went, I'm not personally feeling generous enough to assume it was an after-interview outage. Not one trained investigator thought to record on their cell phone or a battery-operated digital recorder or a tape deck. I know the government runs behind on updating equipment, and I have to believe there is at least one tape deck lurking somewhere at CID. Brandon actually later alleged that in this first conversation, the CID agent interrogating him threatened to put him in jail if he asked for a lawyer, and that he hadn't actually made any admissions. As endearing as I'm sure Brandon the drug dealer is, I don't believe him on this one. The trial judge later conducted a hearing about Brandon's allegations and similarly concluded that they didn't happen. During this initial interview, Brandon consented to a search of his barracks room and of his car. Investigators asked hopefully if they could also search his phone, and Brandon politely declined. CID took protective possession of the cell phone because Brandon's response was the equivalent of slapping a neon sign across his cell phone saying, "The good stuff's in here." They couldn't risk Brandon leaving and deleting the incriminating things they were now pretty sure lived just beyond his passcode. Then Agent Pledger took everything he learned from the interview and went to Brandon's command, requesting authorization to search his cell phone. In the civilian system, police go to a civilian judge to obtain a search warrant, and they have to show that they have probable cause to believe that there's evidence of a crime in the thing or place they want to search. In contrast, in the military system, for searches conducted on base or of military personnel or property, investigators can seek authorization from either the unit commander or the installation commander. Basically, a commander can authorize a search of any place that they own, any place that they have jurisdiction over. For example, a battalion commander can authorize a search of the barracks room of the Marines in their battalion. However, the battalion commander could not order a search of just any barracks room on base. In contrast, the installation commander, since they have command over the entire installation, can authorize a search of any of the barracks rooms on their base. For off-base searches of non-military property, investigators have to coordinate with civilian authorities and get a search warrant from a civilian judge. After telling the command about the admissions Brandon made in his interview, Agent Pledger went on to explain how the narcotics trade works. He later added that if Brandon hadn't revealed in that initial conversation that yes, he was the intended recipient of the package, the investigation would have been sunk. Without an admission, all the evidence that anyone had was a package that may or may not have belonged to Brandon, and it's unlikely that would have been a strong enough link to have earned a search warrant for the contents of Brandon's phone. The battalion commander, that's Brandon's unit commander, evaluated the information presented by Agent Pledger and determined that probable cause existed to search the cell phone. The battalion commander granted oral authorization to conduct the search. Agents found a bonanza of incriminating evidence. Brandon had text message threads with someone with the most adorable street name, Teddygrams, along with photos and audio and video recordings that laid out everything Brandon had been doing to import drugs. There were photos of a brick of methylone, but that wasn't all. A diverse drug portfolio is important, and investigators learned that it wasn't just ecstasy analogues Brandon had been distributing. Brandon's cell phone also held evidence of Brandon's booming steroid business, including photos of Brandon holding up vials that were labeled steroids and large rolls of cash. To be clear, he documented all of this himself. There were no sting operations or telephoto lenses required. Steroids can be a big business on a Marine Corps base. People really love lifting heavy things and putting them back down again in an effort to get swole. It was on a Marine Corps base that I learned that deer velvet, that soft coating on antlers, contains insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, which is a banned performance-enhancing drug. At the gym on base, there were multiple reminders posted, warning against using deer velvet for gains in case it would be mistaken for IGF-1 on a drug screening. The next day, with power restored at CID directed Brandon to come back for a second interview. In that second interview, he again admitted to importing methylone for distribution. This second interrogation motivated CID to really step up their investigation. They soon discovered that packages addressed to Brandon actually had a fun little history with Customs. They found out that in October 2011, Customs intercepted another box for Brandon, and after it tested positive for methylone, they destroyed it. The first bite was free, but Customs must have run out of patience and grace for illegal imports. So when the November box arrived and it seemed equally suspect, that's when Customs turned it over to CID to pursue further. CID continued digging and searched for prior residents at the address on the package. They found another service member, actually another Navy corpsman. Lo and behold, the Navy corpsman was a friend of Brandon's. What a small world. Brandon's friend testified at Brandon's court-martial that Brandon had previously asked if he could have packages delivered to the house sometimes. There are, of course, size restrictions for what can be delivered to on-base mailrooms, and some stores don't ship to military addresses. But this wasn't getting a spin bike delivered to an off-base address one time. This was a sustained import operation. Many military move in the summer, and this house was vacant when both the October and November packages were intercepted. It's a logical conclusion that Brandon had been receiving packages at his friend's off-base address for quite some time. First, Brandon had admitted as much. And even without Brandon's incriminating statements, we know the October shipment of methylone was confiscated and destroyed. The November shipment of dimethylone was intercepted and used as bait. But there were plenty of pictures on his phone with other deliveries. And as it turned out, Brandon was very industrious. He'd provided methylone to over 100 smoke shops near Camp Pendleton, California, which is just north of Oceanside in San Diego County. The smoke shops cut, packaged, and marketed these so-called bath salts for sale. It's very clear that Brandon knew that what he was doing wasn't kosher. If it was fully legal, the smoke shops wouldn't need his assistance. He wouldn't have to order the drugs from China, and it would have been fine to order it to his P.O. box on base. I separately have a lot of questions about why smoke shops were purchasing white powder from some random dude and felt comfortable cutting it with something, packaging it, and selling it to others for consumption. This did predate the massive spike in fentanyl overdoses, but just barely. At court-martial, Brandon pled not guilty, which is a little surprising given his admissions along the way. One fun fact I want to drop with you all about courts-martial. In the military system, unlike the civilian system, the panel does not have to be unanimous in order to convict. In the military, the prosecutor only needs to convince 3/4 of the panel that the accused is guilty. At a general court-martial panel with 8 members, which is the typical number of panel members at a general court-martial, that means the prosecutor only needs 6 members on the panel or jury to find the accused guilty in order to convict. It took nearly 3 years to get to verdict day in Brandon's trial, and I cannot find anything that explains why. So I'm going to assume it was caught up in motions practice. In August 2014, the panel convicted Brandon Darnall of conspiracy to import and distribute controlled substances, making false official statements, importation, manufacture, possession with intent to distribute, distribution of controlled substances or controlled substance analogues, and using a communication facility in furtherance of a conspiracy. Brandon was found guilty of 27 separate violations and faced a maximum confinement of 318 years. The panel sentenced Brandon to 6 years confinement, reduction to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. The commander that creates the court-martial, who's known as the convening authority, gets to review, approve, correct, or disapprove of a sentence. In Brandon's case, the convening authority suspended confinement in excess of 5 years and ordered the sentence executed. Navy. I believe this week's safety brief is yours. Ordering designer drugs of dubious composition from China for distribution at and around U.S. military installations is small deck energy. Legal Beagles, this post-conviction action is wild. Let's dig in. On appeal, Brandon raised 2 issues, and I'm going to focus on the first issue that he raised, the issue of probable cause. Brandon's legal team asserted that Agent Pledger and his team violated Brandon's constitutional rights when they arrested him at the mailroom. As background to this issue, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution guarantees all persons the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. A search is a search, and a seizure essentially just means an arrest. So what makes either of them unreasonable? The courts have held that searches and seizures are reasonable when authorized by a competent authority after a determination that probable cause exists. So flipping that, a search or seizure is unreasonable when it's authorized by someone who doesn't have the authority to authorize it, or when there is not probable cause at the time a warrant is issued to believe the person has committed a crime. Ultimately, this appeal revolved around a very basic question. Did Agent Pledger have probable cause to arrest Brandon? Were there reasonable grounds to believe, at the time he was arrested in the mailroom, that an offense had been committed? And describing probable cause is kind of difficult because most definitions refer to intangibles. It's more than bare suspicion, but less than a preponderance of the evidence. And that can make it difficult to know when you have probable cause and when you're about to fail a constitutional challenge. People often tell attorneys that we are not supposed to give percentages for things, probably because we are, by and large, not great at math. For example, it's kind of taboo to describe beyond a reasonable doubt as 95-ish% certainty. That said, I'm going to do it because you're not my jury. A preponderance of the evidence is 50.1%. It's something that's more likely than not. Let's assign bare suspicion 5 to 10%. I like to think of probable cause as somewhere around 30%. Here's what CID knew at the moment of arrest, and what the appellate courts could look at to determine whether Agent Pledger had probable cause to arrest Brandon at the mailroom. First, customs agents seized a package mailed from China. Second, the package contained more than 2 pounds of dimethylone powder. Third, the package was addressed to a Brandon Darnall at a vacant property off base. Fourth, there were 3 Brandon Darnalls located in the entirety of San Bernardino County. Fifth, only one of these Brandons was in the military. Finally, sixth, the Brandon Darnall that was in the military was stationed on board Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms, which was near the vacant off-base property. The Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals decided there was probable cause for apprehending Brandon. And I think the case can be made that this was a reasonable conclusion. 1 Brandon Darnall of 3, 33.3%, probable cause, done. But the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces disagreed. Ultimately, the court just didn't think those facts by themselves were enough to rise to probable cause. And although this shouldn't have gone into the probable cause determination, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces seemed really peeved with just how sloppy Agent Pledger and his team were in conducting their investigation. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces usually doesn't name people in their opinion. They like to err on the side of privacy and protection. But here they outed Agent Pledger by name. Let's look at the low-light reel of some of Agent Pledger's investigative failures. The Court of Appeals called Agent Pledger's efforts a hasty and flimsy initial investigation. He hadn't talked to the owner or previous renters of the house. And Agent Pledger only had a few clues: the drugs within the package, the address on the package, and the phone number. The phone number that he didn't even try calling before he made his arrest. Agent Pledger failed to follow up with customs, so he didn't learn there was a previous October box that was intercepted and destroyed until after arresting Brandon. The court seemed particularly sketched out by the team's so-called controlled delivery. A controlled delivery is an authorized law enforcement technique, and here it would have looked like delivering a decoy package to the vacant house off base and staking it out to see who picked it up, to see whether Brandon in particular showed up to claim the package. However, Agent Pledger inexplicably rerouted the package to the regimental mailroom and had Brandon called in to retrieve it. The court really didn't like this technique, stating it bore little resemblance to a controlled delivery and would not in any way confirm Brandon's involvement to a degree significant enough to establish probable cause. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces determined that the meager preliminary investigation uncovered nothing aside from a name that could connect Brandon to the box. And let's be fair, this was objectively sloppy police work. Agent Pledger went by the vacant house and saw the for rent sign. He could have called the owner of the home right then and there to ask about previous tenants. Agent Pledger could have talked to Brandon's roommate. He could have asked about his mail habits and whether he often drove off base and came back with packages, or whether he was frequently gone on trips delivering drugs 2.5 hours away to Camp Pendleton. He could have determined how far away each of the 3 Brandon Darnalls were from the address. For instance, if 2 lived 100 miles away, while this Brandon was 3 miles away, maybe that's a few extra percentage points towards probable cause. Agent Pledger could have actually just called the other 2 Brandons to see what they had to say, whether they'd ever lived at 29 Palms. Or Agent Pledger could have called the number on the package, or at a bare minimum, looked up who it belonged to. He could have subpoenaed Brandon's phone records to determine who his frequent calls were to. Maybe he would have found the smoke shops that Brandon was working with. He could have checked in with the post office and gotten their delivery log for previous packages, or spoken with the mail carrier who probably thought it was really weird to drop off packages from China to a vacant house. Agent Pledger could have followed up with customs before Brandon's arrest and found out about the October shipment. Agent Pledger could have conducted an actual controlled delivery or had the post office mark the tracking number as delivered and then conducted a stakeout at the vacant house to see whether Brandon showed up looking for the box. Or he could have tailed Brandon for a bit to learn about his habits. For instance, whether he was in the habit of driving past the off-base address to check for a delivery. Agent Pledger could have investigated. The court concluded there was no probable cause to arrest Brandon, so what happens to everything he said after that? If evidence is found as a result of an unlawful search, seizure, or interrogation, it's deemed to be fruit of the poisonous tree, and it's inadmissible at trial, unless an exception applies. Generally, courts exclude evidence in order to stop law enforcement from engaging in bad behavior. Law enforcement knows that if they behave badly, their evidence won't be admissible. The court's enforcement mechanism is making that evidence inadmissible. However, if the police were not being naughty and just made a reasonable mistake, the rationale for excluding evidence goes away. Excluding evidence doesn't really serve to prevent police gone wild if it was an honest and understandable mistake. The government argued on appeal that this was a reasonable police mess-up. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces disagreed. They called Agent Pledger's apathetic and sloppy investigation the exact type of conduct that the exclusionary rule is designed to deter. An apathetic investigator is not a reasonable investigator. Another exception to the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine is the inevitable discovery rule. Basically, if law enforcement would have discovered this evidence anyways, even without a constitutional violation, the courts shouldn't exclude the evidence. One Supreme Court case in particular, Nix v. Williams, illustrates this rule. In Nix, a 10-year-old girl in Des Moines, Iowa, disappeared. The police identified a suspect who was seen carrying a small body wrapped in an army blanket. His name was Mr. Williams. Police thought Mr. Williams left the young girl, or her body, between Des Moines and a specific rest stop where they recovered some of the girl's clothing. Police, along with 200 volunteers, began to search in this identified area. Mr. Williams surrendered to the police, was arraigned, and lawyered up. Police went to pick Mr. Williams up and told his counsel they would not be questioning him on the drive back to Des Moines. But on that drive back to Des Moines, they began a conversation with Mr. Williams, without his attorney present. Mr. Williams made incriminating statements, specifically telling police that he had disposed of the child's body along a gravel road. He actually suggested they stop and find it on the drive back to Des Moines. Mr. Williams eventually agreed to direct officers to the girl's body. With this development, the police called off the search, and later realized search teams were only 2.5 miles away from the ditch where Mr. Williams placed the girl's body. Even though the police obtained this confession in violation of Mr. Williams's Sixth Amendment right to counsel, the Supreme Court held that the evidence derived from the confession was still admissible. If Mr. Williams hadn't experienced a crisis of conscience in the car, the group of police and 200 volunteers would have inevitably discovered the young girl's body. In Brandon's case, the government sought to imply this inevitable discovery rule, because the government would have inevitably obtained the evidence from Brandon's cell phone anyway. But in order for something to be inevitably discovered, that presupposes that the investigator is investigating. Agent Pledger told the battalion commander that absent Brandon's confession, his investigation would have ended and that he had no case. He hadn't been building up to a search of Brandon's cell phone. He tried exactly one thing and would have quit if it hadn't gone his way. Up until the unlawful arrest, Agent Pledger had only driven past a vacant house and conducted some police theater by delivering Brandon the box in a fresh and unexpected place. Yes, a diligent investigator could have certainly connected all these dots, but it feels more appropriate to take Agent Pledger at his word. He wasn't going to put in the work. Under different circumstances, maybe the government's inevitable discovery argument would be persuasive. Your most extremely average investigator would have gotten all of that evidence eventually. But we didn't have your most extremely average investigator. We had Agent Pledger. In any event, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces reversed the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals and overturned Brandon's court-martial conviction and sentence. It's not enough that Brandon clearly imported and distributed drugs and drug analogues. It's not enough to be able to prove your case. You have to do it within the bounds of the law. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. Brandon was released from custody on July 7, 2017, after serving about 3 years of his 5-year sentence. There aren't that many search results that come back for Brandon. He had a pretty fresh slate when he got out of prison. He no longer had a criminal conviction, and he likely now had an honorable discharge. Because his conviction was overturned, Brandon also probably received a lump sum payment for 3 years of back pay. Brandon had an opportunity to move forward in a way that felt right to him. What felt right to Brandon was to announce to the whole world via Twitter, "Started this in 2013, then got sent to jail till July 7th of 2017. Got my case overturned and set free, LOL, hit me up." It seems Brandon is now a flourishing tattoo artist. Before I wrap up today, I want to take a quick moment to wish my big brother the happiest of birthdays. I can't wait to hear how you're celebrating. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, subscribe, and rate it wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any case suggestions or other feedback, please email me at conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time and we'll discuss a murder case 3 decades in the making. Until then, take care.